right? Teaching about authority, teaching about the political system, all right? How American government works, what people in authority do, right? And not just elected officials, but unelected officials, such as police officers. What is the scope of their authority as given to them from the government? What are democratic principles, all right, etc. Okay, now that carries through for sure, right, in regard to both primary school and secondary school. But let's talk a little bit about college, because that's what we're in right now. College tends to have a liberalizing effect. Okay, now most likely because college gets you out of those communities and those peer groups that we're going to talk about here in a second, right? Where you're around people with different ideas, right? And what happens when you go to college and you're around different people, different ideas, you're learning about different subjects, you're being exposed to things that often might make you uncomfortable, right? The reality is that you realize the world is just not black and white. You might grow up in a very black and white world, right? We all did, probably to a certain degree, largely because of the impact on our family, largely because of the influence of our family, right? That's a pretty powerful deal. Again, very much related to peers in our community that we're going to talk a little bit here, all right? But again, as a rule of thumb, and what I want you to get down in your notes, right, is that college attendance, the college experience tends to have a liberalizing effect. Those who go to college tend to be a little bit more liberal on time. Now, is it necessarily a party affiliation breaker? And the answer is no. Okay, so what I would tell you, and what you would also want to get down in your notes, is really this. If your parents are Republicans, you're likely to stay Republican even if you go to college. Now, you might become a little bit more liberal, all right, but you'll most likely go ahead and stay a Republican, okay? So again, getting down into those cleavages, right? Looking at different groups, different subsets of groups. So you might have a little bit more of a liberal feel, right? You might be open to other things, but it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to break with party affiliation, all right? Now, peers and community. There's a lot of political socialization that takes place as you grow up, very much related to your schools, right? Bumping back up, and your community. Now, the question becomes, of course, is how diverse is the community? The more diverse, likely the more liberal, all right? Why? Much like with the college effect, you're exposed to different ideas, different ways of thinking, different religions, etc. All right? If you grow up in a neighborhood like that's very homogenous, like mine, all right, the neighborhood I grew up in, chances are you're not going to be as liberal, all right? Now, for me, of course, you know, and like with a lot of other people, right, family is still probably the strongest influence, right? So if we had to decide which is stronger in terms of political socialization, which has stronger impact, your family or your peers, and it's likely to be your family again, all right? Very hard to get away from that, okay? But again, your peers do impact what it is you believe politically as well as your greater community. Okay, religion. Religion certainly has a very, very strong impact on political socialization. There are conservative religions, there are liberal religions, okay? How your religion believes in gender roles, what they think gender roles should be, what they believe that society, culture should look like, is going to have a great impact. Now again, you think for those that engage in, who are raised with religion and engage in regular attendance, all right, that particular religion has really a captive audience to talk about, right? It's tenets, if you will, okay? And that has a strong impact. Now, we're going to talk about religion again here when it comes to social groups, but nonetheless, religion does have a very strong impact. However, is it as strong as family? No. All right? It's still not as strong as family. Okay, the media. All right, now, the media, of course, has a strong impact on political socialization. This is how we learn about what's going on. This is how we learn about those significant events that might take us in one direction versus another. again, which we'll talk about once more. We talked about wars, things like that, but we'll talk about 9/11 here in a second. But on average, right, especially younger persons, they spend 53 hours a week engaged in media. All right, it's about 2,800 hours, all right, a year engaged in media. That's more than your work life. Right? If you think about working 40 hours a week, that's 13 hours. I know we all know nobody works only 40 hours a week anymore. I get that, but nonetheless, that's quite a bit. All right? Media has a strong impact. Choice of media has an even stronger impact. So what media are you watching, right? You watching liberal media? Conservative media, and that exists. I mean, the media would always like you to believe that it's always centrist and open, but that's absolutely not the case. There are media outlets that are conservative, media outlets that are liberal. Some that are in the middle, some that are centrist. Now, having said that, people that flock to a particular media that's more conservative or more liberal will most likely have an even more conservative or more liberal corresponding political belief system. All right, so the idea is if you're watching something that's more conservative or reading something that's more conservative, you'll probably stay over there. If you're watching something that's liberal or reading something that's more liberal, you're probably going to stay over there. Again, more powerful than family? No. All right, so far, all right, if you're keeping a scorecard, right, we look at schools, religion, community, peers, and the media, nothing trumps family. All right, that's not to say those things might have a little bit of an influence, right, especially when it comes to college attendance, but family is still much more important, okay? Now, media is one thing, social media is another, okay? So you think about Facebook, or you think about any LinkedIn even, or any kind of, I'm important and special.com type of website. There's two things. Number one, it tends to be encompassing, right? So when you're on social media, all right, you tend to be around people that are a lot like you, right? Your social media groups are a lot like you. Okay, so it really doesn't have much of an effect. There's an effect in the sense, much like choosing the media, whether you want to choose a conservative media or a liberal media, you'll probably stay in that particular political mindset. But again, social media, it tends to keep us all kind of right together. Now, a couple things. Can social media unite people? Absolutely. Can it create change? Absolutely. Many analysts that do this type of thing for a living study, well, let me take it one step further. Not only they study social media, but also international relations, would argue that social media had a lot to do with the Arab Spring and the revolutions that we saw 7 years ago in 2011, starting in 2011, pretty significant. But the other question that pops up, of course, is whether it's trustworthy, right? Is social media trustworthy? And that's something that's very different than the traditional media, okay? Even the liberal media, even the conservative media, there are some real standards that journalists adhere to, okay? That's not the case with social media. Social media is a different ballgame, right? You don't see the same type of reporting ethics, right? Even the most liberal and the most conservative media outlets really do adhere to a set of journalistic ethical principles, and social media does not. It's free from all of those things if it wishes to be, right? If it wishes to be. Okay, now what about events, right? 9/11 can socialize us. Again, 9/11 is probably the most significant example that I can think of. Most of people my age, and even probably about 10 years younger, or through about 10 years younger, most of you don't, some of you might not have been born just yet, remember exactly where they were at 9/11. I was teaching at another university. I can tell you exactly where I was when I found out about it. In fact, I was teaching a class and was canceled that day. We had to cancel all classes that day. Had somebody actually came into my classroom and said, "Jarrod, we're done." With that said, there was an immediate two two sources of change, right, in regard to political socialization. Number one, we had a very quick realization that international terrorism could affect us here on American soil. Now, before 9/11, that's just not something we thought about. We didn't think about international terrorism here in the United States. Immediately, part of our socialization across just about every cleavage, by the way, all right, race, gender, ethnicity, age, whatever. We had that realization. That became a concern almost right away for all of us, right? Or I should say right away for almost all of us, all right? Again, maybe domestic terrorism is something we had feared, or we knew was possible, especially after the 1995 Oklahoma City bombing in, at the Federal Building, the Muir Federal Building. But having said that, the other thing is that right away, right, there was a lot of political support for going to war right after 9/11 in Afghanistan and even in Iraq, right, which followed just a little bit later, just about, well, not quite 2 years later, about a year and a half later, we wound up in Iraq as well. President Bush's, the second President Bush, President George W. Bush, his poll ratings were sky high. He was in the 90s. We all rallied around, right? But the one thing that we knew about that event is that it was temporary, okay? Support for the war, right, almost exponentially went down, all right? President Bush's approval ratings went down very, very quickly to the point where he was in a very tight 2004 contest and barely won, all right? A very, very tight election against Senator John Kerry. So again, amazing levels of support for the president, support for going to war, belief in international terrorism, something that can attack us here. But those things really went down very, very quickly. Now, with that said, one of the personal things that I've experienced as an educator is I can't tell you how many students I've had that as soon as 9/11 occurred, they enlisted. Right, and I've had those incredible discussions with these students over the years, over 15, 16 years, especially if they went, deployed, and came back. Frankly, amazing. It's just how they were just mesmerized by what was taken. And I don't mean that in a bad way or a way that's not justified. It's absolutely justified. I mean, one of the things you got to keep in mind when it comes to political socialization, it's not for anybody to judge. We're just kind of laying it out there. But just amazing how they just were struck and they felt like they had to do something almost right away. It really, it's frankly, it's amazing. Okay. Now, let's go ahead and look at social groups and political values, all right? Now, with that said, what we're doing now is finally getting down into those cleavages, right? And what we're doing is now looking at economics as a way to separate people, race as a way to separate people. Not in a bad way, but just in terms of belief systems, all right? Now, one of the things that, I'll share with you that I found amazing, I've been a political scientist for a long time, is the neighborhood I lived in. My mother lived in it too, up here in Akron, West Akron, a very integrated, wonderful neighborhood. Very middle class, working class to middle class, and we had again an integrated population. And my mom was always talking to the neighbors and involved, and there were some very active African American women, politically active African American women. And this is the time in 2008 when Barack Obama was still was going against in the primaries, going against Hillary Clinton. So you think about that cleavage, right? African American women, would they break for Obama? Would they break for Hillary, right? Would they follow race or would they follow gender? Or neither, right? Or neither, okay? And it was amazing that my mom, being very politically active as well, almost the whole neighborhood, right, supporting Hillary Clinton. It was just, it's fascinating. It's like, come on, tell my mom to get active. Come on, Brenda, we need to go see Hillary. It's just fascinating stuff. Just interesting. Okay, all right, so what can we say about economic bases, right? Okay, now, we do know a couple things about economics, right? Number one, the wealthier we tend to be, more conservative, right? Anti-tax, anti-big government, okay? All right, more open to free trade, and then just the opposite would be true as well. All right, persons of lesser means oppose free trade, want more government involvement, don't mind higher tax systems, largely because they may benefit through income redistribution. Okay. What about education? Now, education tends to work almost hand in hand with wealth and economics, right? People with higher education levels make much more than those with lower education levels. However, remember, education has that liberalizing effect, right? Now, higher educated people tend to vote liberal. They tend to vote with Democrats, and then just the opposite, okay? So, and the opposite is true as well. Those with lower levels of education tend to be a little bit more conservative, tend to vote Republican. Now, that was not always the case. If I were teaching this class in the 1950s and 60s, those groups would probably be flipped. Now, you could also make an argument that at the very, very low rungs of education, which mirror the low rungs of economic wealth, that group tends to vote Republican, or that group tends to vote Democratic as well. So at the very high levels of education, Democratic. At the very low levels, Democratic. That big middle, right, often Republican. But again, education is one of those things that just, you know, plays around with the, kind of distorts, if you will, the economic basis. Okay. Religion. All right, a couple things I find religion absolutely fascinating. All right. Now, we can say a couple things about religion. This is what I would want you to get down in your notes almost right away. Number one, fewer people consider themselves to be religious. Fewer people attend worship religiously. Fewer people believe in God. However, those numbers of those that do say religion plays a large part in their lives, do attend, do believe in God, are still a super majority. All right? Well over 3/4. Okay? 3/4 and above, I should say, probably best. But nonetheless, those numbers are coming down, all right? Those who are Protestant, all right, tend to vote conservative, tend to vote Republican, right? Those who are Catholic, Jewish, right, tend to vote liberal, tend to vote Democratic. Now, there are some separations here. Traditional Roman Catholics tend to vote Republican more so now, all right? There are some Protestants, such as Episcopalians, right? Those who are part of the more liberal Protestant set of denominations tend to vote Democratic, all right? There are some variations there for sure, all right? Fascinating stuff. Okay, race and ethnicity. Now, again, probably the most interesting dynamic, because race and ethnicity, along with religion, is often tied to family. And we talked about, in regard to political socialization, how strong family really is in affecting this. Okay? Now, with that said, all right, racial minorities tend to vote liberal, tend to vote with the Democratic Party, right? Those who are Caucasian, right, tend to vote Republican, tend to vote conservative. Now, again, are there white liberals? Of course. Are there African American, Latino American, Asian American, Native American persons that vote Republican? Absolutely. Okay, so they're not complete. But remember, if we're creating cleavage, just think about a wealthy African American person with high levels of education. Where do they vote? Again, creating those cleavages, it becomes much more difficult. We don't have the time to get into those groups. But again, political analysts, those who are strategists, right, they need to do that. They need to find out what a Caucasian Jewish male living on the west side of Akron in an integrated neighborhood, how is that person going to vote? Right? And why does he buy Tide? Right? That kind of thing. Again, it's no different. It's very, very compelling. It's fascinating. Okay? Now, one thing to keep in mind with race and ethnicity, right, is that you do have a lot of impact in regard to cohort replacement we talked about earlier, right? People die off, new people come in, right? But we also have heavy levels of immigration. And I'm not saying that in a bad way or a good way, but nonetheless, that does play a role, right? As new citizens come into this country, how do they affect politics? Now, believe it or not, I know immigration is a very high-profile issue right now. It was by no means, right, had the impact on politics like it did really about 100 years ago through the 1950s, when we saw waves of persons coming in to this country from Europe, Southern Europe, Eastern Europe, other parts of the world that had a profound impact on both economics as well as politics. President Franklin Roosevelt was able to use these large these immigrant population became citizens to his advantage, and built this huge coalition, right, of whites, African Americans, new immigrants that had achieved citizenship, and was very, very successful. All right, gender probably is what I would say is the one factor that's probably underappreciated. One of the things we don't spend enough time talking about. There is a huge gender gap between the two political parties, between the Democrats and the Republicans. The Democrats hold a large group of women, especially, again, cutting down the cleavages, ethnic minorities, racial minority women, almost entirely under the umbrella of the Democratic Party. White women generally tend to be split. They ebb and flow between campaigns. You know, it's funny, white women did come out for President Trump in 2016. They also came out for President Bush in 2004 when we were talking about that election, the first presidential election after 9/11. A lot of those women being very, very concerned about war and safety and security and things of that nature, and wanted to vote for an incumbent president. Fascinating stuff, okay? Women tend to want human needs satisfied, education, healthcare, things like that. They're less likely to desire military intervention. Okay. Now, we can say, however, the gender gap right now is about 15 percentage points on average, right? 50% of women tend to go for the Democrats, 35% go for the Republicans. That's that middle 15%, that undecided group, they bounce back and forth. Okay, they're unreliable, but again, in terms of political affiliation and design, I mean, they'll vote, believe me. If you did not know this, more women vote than men. More women achieve degrees than men right now. The world has changed, certainly in the last 30, 40 years. Regardless, that 15% can swing elections, all right? And again, independent women, we'll call them independent women. Again, they may have a political affiliation, but independent in terms of one election to the next. They are hard to measure, they're hard to gauge, but they are fascinating to study, and we need to find out what they do, okay? Okay, but again, you know, you think about digging down into each one of these cleavages. Wealthy Asian American living in an inner city neighborhood, first generation female who may be Jewish, right? How might that person vote? Now, we don't have the time in class to really to kick that stuff around, but that's what strategists, political analysts do. Try to find out how that person might vote based on all these things, how they're socialized, and then tying it all together is finding out what those people believe. What is their opinion, right? Now again, with 324 million Americans, that can be difficult. Okay, we'll stop there and we'll pick up on Wednesday.